I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Sonya Walger, who you may recognize as an actress, but I recognize as a force in the book community from her podcast, Bookish. Today we are going to be talking about Lion, her debut novel, which is stunning and emotional and all the things you'd want in a story. So Sonya, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here.
So I was hoping we could start, since this is such a personal story for you, with having you set up the book for us and maybe tell us a little bit about how you chose to tell the story right now.
We should address the first part, which is that I call this book a novel because I truly believe that the act of writing anything down is an act of fiction. I think a shopping list is a fiction. I think writing a dream down, I think writing anything down is fiction. And by the same token, I think that everything is autobiography. So they are two sides of the same coin. So the decision to call Lion a novel felt very instinctive and very true. But everything that is in the novel happened. So there's that delicate balance to walk along. My father was an extraordinary and mercurial and make-believe kind of person, the kind of person you want perhaps as your godfather and not as your father. And his whole life was extraordinary and calamitous and fascinating and bewildering as his daughter. And when he died very suddenly 7 years ago, it was both sort of astonishing and also entirely predictable that was how he would go. And I had very young children at the time. They were not quite 1 and not quite 3. And it just broke my heart that they didn't know my father and that these stories were going to be just that, just little word of mouth anecdotes. And it felt really important to get these stories down. And I had no desire to write a sort of memoir of my dad or a conventional, he was born in, he died in. I just, if I'm honest, facts bore me. They just bore me. Even the most beautifully written of biographies, there is a part of me that's like, yeah, but what did they think about? What did they dream about? How did they sound in their heads? So there was an art to finding a way to tell these stories in a way that felt meaningful and also that would render them a book that I would want to read. So it became a sort of practice to write a bit of a story down and pop it on my desktop. For a long time, the folder that all of these stories were in was called Beads, and I would write a bead and put it in a jar, and I didn't know how to thread them yet. And then I discovered that by putting everything in the present tense and writing stories about now, but making it this sort of continuous present, the tense was really the clue. That was how I understood how to write the book all of a sudden.
It is something about these larger than life personalities that really lend this idea of fiction. I mean, how could you put something where every page I couldn't have imagined that this was true? It is the essence of truth is stranger than fiction sometimes, and that's the only way we can write it. And to have that present tense, it was a propulsive feeling as I was reading. You can't stop because you need each of these pieces that come together. You wonder how could they possibly all fit into one life, into one thing, and going through and just always having a little apprehension at what was next because there are so many painful moments just along with the joy, but at the same time, what a wonderful story. I mean, in the truest sense of the word, a story.
Thank you. That's just so lovely to hear. I would hope so. I live in LA. I've worked in Hollywood for years. I've written scripts. I'm married to a script writer. Scripts have been my parallel path for all this time. And people had said to me over the years, why don't you write the movie of your dad? I always said, because nobody would make it. They'd be like, yeah, tone it down. You can get away with so much more in fiction than you can in the tight constraints of a 3 or 4 act structure of a movie. And it never occurred to me to do anything other than try and capture him on the page. That always felt like the challenge.
And did you have a sense of, well, it has to be now as you were writing? I mean, I think that it's one of those things as you go. Sometimes you hear from writers, well, it's been sitting and I've been working, but it takes a lot to be able to say, okay, I'm ready. I want to publish it.
COVID did me the enormous favor of enforced quietude, which it did for so many, I think. My mornings were spent wrangling, what it was, 3 and a 5-year-old into Zoom school, in and out of chairs every day. It was just such a disaster. I was about to swear, but I don't know if I'm allowed to. Anyway, it was a disaster and a nightmare. And I am a horrible teacher. I think we've established that. I'm quite a decent mum, but I'm a horrible teacher. And so every afternoon I would just go and sequester myself in the little writing shed that I had and sit myself down there and begin with, I'm a journal keeper. I've kept journals for 25 years. And so I went and sort of harvested my journals to see what I had in there, to see what I had forgotten that I knew. I'm also, as well as a horrible teacher, I have a horrible memory. So everyone in my family roars with laughter at the idea that I've written anything about the past. They're all like, well, did you make it up? Or where did you get it from? Because I don't remember yesterday. So the journals were very helpful and they became this starting point. They gave me little scoops, if you like, or the beginning of, or the sand with which to blow the bead from. And so those began. And then for a while, during COVID, it became this just little habit of going to write every day. And as I say, there were many moments, as happens with every author, of just despair and like, well, they're just beads rattling in a jar. I've got no idea. I don't know what to do. My best girlfriends remind me with tears running down their cheeks with laughter about me sitting at lunch being like, it's a disaster. There's nothing. I've got nothing. I've got all these bits and nothing coming together. And then that afternoon, I went home and discovered this sort of present tense insight. And then the book came together very quickly. So COVID was the birth of my book. And then I was very fortunate to get this wonderful literary agent who got it out to the right people and then into the hands of NYRB, which was really beyond my wildest dream to land at New York Review of Books publishing. That was more than I could have ever imagined.
I love this idea of these beads because one of my favorite pieces of this book is sort of this nonlinear way that we're presented with the story, that we jump in time, we see moments from a present, from a future, from a past, and it feels like you're telling us a story and that we're listening to something, because that's how we talk, right? We'll be telling something and then realize you need a piece of context to go back to understand something else, and it feels like unfolding memories with someone. And I love that piece of jumping in time. But did you have, I don't know, what was that like to structure? Because did you write it in those orders or are you moving pieces around?
No, not at all. Again, I think so much of this is a function of my faulty memory. I feel like I have this handful of well-thumbed Polaroids, as it were, for memories. And so working each of those into something that rendered itself with a little more explicitness and more color and more specificity. And then realizing that actually what was interesting to me was to arrange these memories thematically rather than chronologically, while still hopefully honoring a chronology that meant you were never lost. You weren't sure which of my father's wives we were talking about. Hopefully that stayed intact. But, to think about how my father thought about money and then all the ways that iterated through both our lives, or how my father thought about family and how to behave with his various daughters and how that iterated, and how I parent now because of how I was parented. That to me, again, I speak this as a reader as much as anything, that to me felt like that's juicy to me. I don't want this to be dry. I don't want this to be a methodical plodding through someone's life. It shouldn't be layers of archaeology. It should be an experience to read this and somehow arranging it loosely thematically. It's certainly not said, money or whatever. But that to me felt like a way that would be more fruitful and a more exciting experience to read it.
I agree. I think, like you were saying, we know very much what a memoir feels like, or even a biography or a fictionalized biography, if we're talking like David Copperfield level of like starting there. And there that doesn't always feel like how life actually feels to be lived in.
Yeah.
And I think when we're reading something, especially if we're thinking, okay, this is autofiction, right, in the grand scheme, there is a personal connection. We want it to feel like life and the life that we recognize.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm obsessive researcher on whatever it is that I'm doing, be it an acting role or a book or a movie or whatever that I'm working on. So I've read nothing but biography for about 2.5 years. I just soaked in everything I could lay my hands on. From my memory is shot at the moment, but anyway, think of a biography, and I've read them all. The one that rang like a bell for me was "On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous" by Vuong, because it had the courage to tell a beautiful story in a back and forth way with deeply poetic language, but that still held me as a story. And I felt like that's what I seek. It's really hard to do. He's extraordinary what he pulls off in that book.
I love mentioning the language because I think the language in this book is so enticing and so encapsulating. I love when we're talking about memory, something that struck me so much in your writing is the idea of sense and how much care you take in describing the felt senses, like scents and temperatures and sounds. And especially for, when you're in Argentina, when you're in Peru, these places that maybe most readers in the US have not experienced and don't have maybe an idea of what they're really like. I love getting able to transport into those places.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think this is, one of the benefits of having been an actor for all these years is you bring your whole body to a performance. So I'm so used to experiencing what the temperature of a room is, what the feel of a chair underneath my legs is, and hopefully bringing that in its subtle way into whatever performance I'm doing. So I'm endlessly grateful to everything I've learned for, the past 30 something years of doing this other job. It all feels deeply, deeply necessary to the act of writing for me.
Is there a difference? I was going to bring this up later, but I feel like it fits now. Is there a difference in the vulnerability in doing something like writing and something like acting and performing? Because this is very you. You're putting yourself out there, though there is a layer of fiction through. I mean, the character's name is still Sonya. But when you act, when you perform, there is an even bigger sort of guard between yourself and what you're performing.
Yeah. I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. I think all art is autobiography. I really do. If you're not making yourself vulnerable, be it as a sculptor or as a painter or as an artist, then you're not really doing the work, I don't think. Annie Dillard, one of my heroes. But she says, gnaw your own bones. And I think that's right. I think it should feel a little bit terrifying to do it, always, whatever it is, but whatever artistic endeavor you're in. If there's something in the pit of your stomach that goes, oh my God, I wish they didn't know this, you're probably tugging on the right thread, I think. So in terms of is one more vulnerable making than the other, yes and no. I mean, it's very hard to do a performance and then just put it out there and have to sit back and watch it on an enormous screen with other people. You can, in theory, hide behind the fact that the lighting was bad and the director used cut you didn't want and the soundtrack sucks. Whatever it is, you can futz with it, but it's you up there. It's your face 40 feet wide. But it is a collaboration. This is all me, completely alone on the page. But it is also a collaboration because reading is a collaborative act. What I wrote and what you read cannot possibly be the same thing. Your experience of my experience of Peru are two different entities. That's sort of miracle of the alchemy of reading. So a lovely question. I think they're all vulnerable. I think it's all vulnerable making, yeah.
And I think for me, I love film, I love television, I love all the sort of performing arts, but there's nothing like the connection that I think you find reading because of that ability to put so much of yourself onto the page, just as much as you're getting back. There are so many times where I've read a novel, maybe I've even read it before, but because of where I am at that exact moment, it is like I'm experiencing an entirely different book just because of what I'm putting in. And I think that's like the best form of communion that I've experienced is.
Yeah, it's true, isn't it? I think rereading is one of the most interesting things we can do, actually. It's such a revisiting of a former self. I reread War and Peace not that long ago. And I just remember being absolutely blown away by what I took away the first time and the second time. I reread Anna Karenina too for when I was doing my podcast Bookish a few years ago. And a guest had picked it, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to reread that too. And I was like, wow, I made this all about Anna and Vronsky last time, and actually, it's just all about Lenin. Like it's just Lenin. It's a completely different book to me. How did I miss that? It's such a revisiting of a former self to be a rereader as well as a reader.
And I think that, I don't know, fiction, especially fiction about people that might challenge us in what we think is a good person, a person we'd want to be around, someone that we would understand. There's nothing that gives me more empathy and understanding than going into a book about something I don't know about, or something that I am not, or my first inclination is, oh, I don't think I'd like that.
So true, isn't it? It's wonderful to be forced into this slightly uncomfortable position of reading something you didn't intend to. I mean, that was, maybe you find this on your podcast, that was one of the many things I loved when I used to host Bookish, was, being confronted by 5 books with every guest that I would never necessarily have picked up myself, or that I thought I knew that I wasn't familiar with. You feel yourself widening at the edges. It's such a lovely feeling to sort of take up more space because of your perhaps enforced intellectual curiosity.
That's me every time I have to read a book about birds, because I'm truly terrified of them, and yet I keep...
Me too. Are you? Me too. It's a
Yes.
genuine pathology. Amazing. I've never met anyone else. My children know it. A bird once flew into the house, and I rang my husband and said, we have to sell the house. I'm so sorry. We're moving out. There's a bird downstairs. I'm out. Call the realtor. I'm not dealing with this.
Yes, that is, especially living in New York with pigeons. They are my enemy.
I'm with you. I'm totally with you. I used to be the same in London. It was horrific.
See, that's the thing. The finding those pieces in a book that you maybe normally wouldn't encounter, or I mean, with your story, there are characters in this book that people might just hear about and think, oh, that's not someone I could understand. That's not someone I could connect to. And yet when we take the time to spend however many pages with someone, I think almost never have I come away feeling like I still felt at the beginning.
It's true. It's so true, isn't it? It's a wonderful leveling to be introduced to new people and then recognize their salient familiarity maybe in there as well.
And we get to confront topics that I think are challenging and difficult. I think grief is a prevalent theme that stood out to me as reading Lion. There are many kinds of grief, I think, that appear, from obviously the grief of death, but also the grief of what we think we should have or deserve in relationships, anticipatory grief, all the ways that sort of that sadness can surprise us. And I think sometimes that is a way we can process things a little bit more fully, is to go through it with someone who might be experiencing it in that story as well.
I think that's right. I mean, I mentioned to you at the beginning, before we started recording, we just lost our house in the Palisades fire here in California. It was our home. It's the home I write about in Lion. It was our home of 17 years. The only house the children knew, had every book I've ever owned, all those journals I told you that I harvested for Lion, 25 years of journals gone, all of it just gone, like so many others. And I'm still, it's only 3 weeks later, I'm reeling from it. We all are. We knew we lived in an area that was spectacularly beautiful and that was high risk. We evacuated knowing there was a risk. but you never really believe it's going to happen. And so now to find ourselves in a borrowed house with 20 books between us and beginning the launch of Lion, it's an extraordinary moment of grief. To be selling, talking about, discussing a book about grief and a book about, overnight reversals. I keep saying to my husband, if my father understood anything, it would be this moment in my life. It would be, I've never missed him more. I feel him very close, not just because of the book, but because I think he, more than anyone in my life, actually would understand what it is to wake up and find everything gone. And the landscape, literal, emotional, metaphorical, to be so radically changed. And the trajectory of your immediate life completely upended. So there is a certain poetry, for lack of a better word, in this being the moment to birth this book, that this is the sort of devastation against which I bring this book into the world. I haven't understood it yet. I haven't, I keep talking to friends who are so loving and compassionate and horrified and text me and ring me. And the phrase that comes up over and over is, I just can't imagine what you're going through. And I keep wanting to say back, nor can I. Like, the imagination does not want to hold this. It's like a cat with a ball. Like, I can't get a purchase on the fact that I was just in my house. I was just in my kitchen. I keep reaching for things on my bedside table and it's not there. Like, it's so impossible. And, we live with this, as you say, this sort of anticipatory grief as our parents age. You hold it at a distance if you're like me and they're like, it's not happening yet, But right? You know that there's a sort of imminence of that as we get older. And yet, absurdly, the solidity of our houses isn't just not in question, even though I live in a fire and earthquake prone area. Your home is an entity, a solid entity that doesn't die. And the death of my house, I had not anticipated. I had not pre-grieved this. I was not ready for this. But this is what happened, and this is where we are, and this is the moment that Lion comes into the world. I suspect there's another book in this moment. I can't imagine writing it yet, but it's an interesting moment to feel quite so saturated with grief.
And the ways that we pass through grief and the way that we either seek connection or seek, the different ways we are, I think animal brains seek to not feel it or to process in ways that are beyond words and beyond, how we can describe. I think that goes into that idea of I can't imagine, and yet our brains and our bodies are still reacting regardless.
Yeah.
And in Lion, there's so much of the back and forth, the pendulation between grief and love, and how quickly and how often they are existing parallel at the same time, right next to each other. And it just, for as much as I say this is a book about grief, I did not find it a book that was sad. I did not find it a book that was hard to read, because there is so much of that love that it just permeates the story.
I'm so glad. I felt that from beginning to end. It is a book about love. That really is what it was meant to be. That is what my intention was. It is my takeaway, even in the sadness of this moment. This is a moment about love. I have never felt so bereft, and I have never felt so loved as I have felt by strangers, by friends, by family from afar, by old friends. I have never felt so, all of us, my whole family, just in cupped hands, supported. And it's a very beautiful thing to feel so stripped and yet so held.
I think it is in many ways the only thing that can fill sort of the vacuum of when such a large piece is taken away, especially the father, that is a huge piece for this Sonya in her world. Everything in weird ways revolves around this relationship. It just always comes back. And then what do you put there when that is gone?
That's right. It's also the lens through which I chose to tell this story. If I wrote the book Lioness, that's a different book. It's a completely different story. That's a different lens to hold up. Nature, there's a different idiom, vernacular. The whole thing becomes a different thing. So it's such an interesting thing to sort of climb into, is how to find the tone of what you're writing that lies truly in line with the story that you're telling. We can tell the same story and make it a comedy, a drama, a suspense, a mystery. It's just in the telling of it. I'm now working. I've sold my second book, which comes out next year, and I'm working on my third, which, God willing, I will get back to one day. And I'm really learning, more and more. I find myself rewriting the same chapter a few ways at the moment. I can't make it lie straight yet. If you haven't got the tone, if you haven't got that key in place, you're still putting beads in a jar. You haven't threaded them yet.
And I think some of the moments where I felt that the most acutely were the moments that are from the father's point of view. I don't know. Are you saying the father, your father? I don't know the article.
It's interchangeable. It's fine. Yeah. Whichever I don't mind.
From the moments that are really from his point of view. Because though you feel his voice through the entire narrative, those pieces that are really from him, I think, are so interesting because, like you were saying long ago, that's what brings this from the idea of a memoir into that fiction, to be able to see in his mind the way that he perceives the events, even from, his time at the gambling tables in Africa all the way through. You can picture that being a heist movie. You can picture some of the moments through. And I think I was so riveted, even the skydiving. That's something I've never done. But it's every year I say I'll do it for my birthday. And maybe this is the year. But it just, I don't know. It kept me so invested.
I'm so glad. Yeah, it was a fun thing to do, and it also, for me, sealed the deal on this is a novel. This isn't biography. If the acting has taught me anything, it is how to disappear and I'm up inside somebody else as though I were a glove puppet. And the act of going inside my dad and imagining what it was like for him to lie in my mother's bedroom before he'd even met her and stare at the clothes in her closet and try and imagine the young woman whose room he's living in, crashing in for the winter. The idea of falling in love with her before he'd even met her, that he'd fallen in love with the idea of this young woman in her clothes, and that he'd read all my grandmother's letters to her that were in the bedstand. And, did any of that happen in real life? I have no idea. I doubt it, maybe. He never told me. But did all of that happen in the truth of the way I wanted this story to be told? Yes, it did, and it had to, and it was necessary. And it felt true, which is, I think, the highest praise I can give any piece of writing is, does it feel true? Does it feel necessary? And those moments of disappearing into my father's consciousness felt deeply, deeply necessary, and interestingly very available to me. They didn't feel murky. They didn't feel like, I don't know what he thought. They felt right there.
And the voice was so distinct from the narrator's voice that I loved being able to pass back and forth, because there is a thread between them. They are related. They do have some similarities in the way that they think, but yet when you're reading in that perspective, you're somewhere else. And I think that really helps. For me, one of my most important things when I'm reading is to feel like I trust the voice that I'm being presented with, and that I know whether or not I like the character, whether or not the plot, that anything could be happening, but I trust that voice is going to take me where I need to go.
Yeah, Yeah, that's right. I think I agree wholeheartedly. I get so worried when I have an unreliable narrator. I sort of I admire the art. I really do. God knows, Lolita is one of the greatest books ever written, but I don't have the stomach for it. I don't have the stomach, certainly not to create it myself. I'm with you. I like a sturdy narrator that I can trust and who I feel is going to help me move me through in the way that I know how to be moved.
And I think that it just lets you sink in. And I think especially when you're talking about such big things like grief and love, I just want to be sort of held by the story in that way.
Yeah.
And I think especially when we get to the pieces about how do we learn to love and how do we learn the things that our parents present us and we make for our own. I love the expanse that you're able to give those subjects.
Thank you so much. It was not an act of therapy, this book, and yet it was very healing to write it, I must say.
And I think that readers will find that healing as well. I think anybody who has parents, which is many people, has those moments of realizing your parents are people and realizing that that they're doing life for the first time just alongside of you. And though there is some extremes in this story that I think many people would be entirely unfamiliar with,
yes,
the feeling I think underneath it is all the same.
I think so. That was sort of what I was hoping for because, a man who raced Formula One and skydived and polo players and all the other things they're not going to spoil for everyone, but let's say large and disruptive life events to everyone concerned, multiple marriages, continent hopping, while the fact or the actual sort of iterations might be unique and in some ways glamorous, in inverted commas, that was never my experience of them. It was not glamorous to get on a plane alone, age 9, in the early 80s and fly somewhere again that sounded exotic, to go and meet him on my own, and for us to be in these sort of strange hotel rooms making up a sort of fake life together for 4 days so that we could see each other. There was nothing glamorous in that experience. It's glamorous when you tell it in your 20s, 30s over a drink at dinner. But the actual experience of the loneliness of the voyage and then the loneliness of wanting intimacy with a parent who can only manage a certain amount, I think that's a universal experience. If you're in a hotel room or you're in a bedsit with your dad 4 blocks away, I think the experience of adoration and sort of estrangement is one that anyone has experienced. Perhaps anyone with divorced parents or anyone with parents, walking from one room to another and having a different experience with that person that you sense is incomplete, even though you're hungry for something bigger. That was the universality that I was hoping for, and my way in was to be as specific as possible with the nuances of everything that happened to me, because I think in those specificities you open up the universality of an experience.
There were moments I had while I was reading that I was talking to friends and being like, that part has to have been fictionalized. That one can't have been real. But being like, I don't know. That is how life is. There are so many things I think for any of us have stories that when we tell someone would say, that sounds like I must be making it up. And yet we all know that is the absurdity of life, that the strangest things can and do happen, and we just have to keep living through them.
That's right. That's what I'm in right now. And you just put one foot in front of the other and get through the day.
And literature is one of the things we have to fall back on. And since I'm a bookseller, I feel I have to ask. And since you have had these conversations with many people, I'd love to talk a little bit about your literary influences and some of your favorites.
Oh, yeah, happily. Like I say, I'll warn you now by saying my brain is pudding at the moment. I'll walk into a room and just stand there blankly, not knowing what I'm doing there. I think this is an actual effect of a huge shock, because this is beyond menopausal memory loss. This is a transcendental thing where I literally will walk up and down the street being like, I don't know where my car is, and I sort of don't remember which my car is. So I just walk around clicking my beeper, waving for something to light up. So I'll preface everything by saying, if I can't remember Henry James's name, bear with me. But he was someone I've always loved.
Anything you want to talk about? I know that in your episode of Bookish, I know you talked about Henry James. I know you talked about Richard Yates and James Salter. Yeah. I know that those are some big ones for you, but anything else?
So a book that I read that I couldn't get over, I'm reading tons of Virginia Woolf, but that's my third book that I'm reading. So I read a book at the end of last year, Her First American by Laurie Segal. I was completely floored by this book. I put it down and looked around and sort of rang people going, are they teaching this in school? Why are they not teaching this? This is a classic. Why does everyone not know about this book? Laurie Segal then went on to die a month later. And the New York Times ran a huge obituary. She was in her 90s. She was publishing in the New York, publishing short stories in the New Yorker right up until, the week that she died. You're nodding because you're a great reader and you know her. But I think I want to just stand from the rooftops yelling to everybody to read Her First American. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary book. It's set in, Mad Men, New York, about a young Viennese refugee who's just come over from, Jewish and fleeing the Holocaust, and she meets an African American intellectual in her first week of arriving in New York City. And it is the love affair that unfolds against the backdrop of early 50s New York. It is absolutely transcendent. I couldn't get over that book. So that has been an important book recently. Again, then when the New York Times, and everyone was like, oh, Laurie Segal. And I was like, I was here first. I found her a month ago. But she's a recent pinup for me. Virginia Woolf is someone I come back to and back to and back to. I really, like, for so many writers, particularly women, I've read all her diaries. She's one of the few biographies Hermione Lee wrote them a wonderful biography of Woolf. And as I say, she's a character in this third book that I'm working on. So she's like a constant. She's just like wallpaper for me. She's with me wherever I go. When I evacuated, Mrs. Dalloway was in my bag. That's a big one. I tend right now, as I say, I'm all about the research. So I hone in for a deep dive on writers who are either working on the area that I'm working on, or who tonally are doing something in the area that I'm working on. So right now, what I'm doing has some dark comedy to it. So an English writer called Sylvia Townsend Warner, who I just, again, absolutely love. She's got a couple of old books that I have been diving deep into. The year before, and Evelyn Waugh, again, just for the dark comedy, Decline and Fall, Vile Bodies, Scoop. They're also the era this next book takes place between the wars, so there's the right area for me. But I have 3 or 4 books going at any one time. My editor just beautifully sent me a box of books that she handpicked so that we could begin to rebuild my library. And on there was Helen DeWitt, The Last Samurai, which I've been meaning to read and never got to. And it's wonderful and absurd and insane and preposterous that was this woman's first novel. It's incredible. I'm 40 pages in and I'm so grateful that it's a place just to disappear and hide and forget the world. That's something I write about in Lion, that books as an only child, books for my brothers and sisters, books for where I figured the world out, as they are for so many writers, I think.
As another only child, I agree.
Yeah.
I love getting to hear about those connections and those influences, because I think just in the same way that all things are fiction, I think we never fully lose things we read. Everything sort of makes up this grand scheme of who we are as readers and writers. So I love getting to hear those things. And I wonder too, as we round things out, if you have like a perfect reader or someone that you really hope finds this book?
I think for me, it's such a given that women read. It would be very meaningful to me for men to read this book. I think fathers to read this book. It's a role I find so endlessly fascinating. Watching my husband parent our kids is a revelation to me every day. I always laugh and say, "You got so lucky. The bar was so damn low. You literally just you rolling out of bed in the morning is already miles ahead of where my dad was. You teaching the kids chess is just the icing on the cake." It's something I suspect I will be, interrogating loosely for my whole life. Is this division of labor, this role of the mother and the father. So I think it's not my ideal reader. It would be my most coveted reader, I think, to have men who were fathers or have had fathers read this book.
Love that. And I think that there are so many people that will find their things that they're passionate about and that they care about in these pages. There's so much to unfold as the memories go through. So thank you so much, Sonya, for joining us, and thank you for writing this book. And Lion is out now.
Thank you, and thank you for being such a beautiful and loving reader. So grateful.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.